All right, welcome to the Acquivore podcast. This is episode 4. Today we're going to talk about the contract management standard. I'm here with Nick Sanders of Apogee Consulting and Jennifer Townsend of Contracting Courses. I'm Don Mansfield. I'm the owner of Don Acquisition LLC. I provide training in federal contracting. My main courses are Simplified Acquisition Procedures course and also the DFARS course. I also have done some training on FAR, DFARS, subcontract flowdowns, and I have some other courses here, comparative contracting methods, contract administration course, and the small business programs course. I'm also available for customized training if your organization has a specific need. Um, Go ahead and contact me. My number is up here, 858-324-6563. You can also send me a message through the website, and I will get back to you usually within 24 hours. That's done acquisition. Let Jennifer tell you about contracting courses.
I'm Jennifer Townsend. I am the owner of Contracting Courses, handily available at contractingcourses.com. And I recently departed from the government after many years of doing a lot of different things in contracting. And the primary need that I saw in training was for a course on the FAR clauses. So I have written and developed a course on FAR clauses, and the other primary course I have right now is on commercial contracts over the life cycle to include the major differences in performance to include risk and liability. So that is me.
Nick.
Thanks, Don. Well, unlike Don and Jennifer, I have never worked for the federal government. I've only worked for federal government contractors. And I've done so for quite a long time, more than 30 years. And in addition, I founded Apogee Consulting, about 11 years ago now, to provide a bunch of different services, not as much training as much as really more operational support, administration support, cost accounting, CAS, business systems, things like that. So, we had kind of here between the three of us, we have a little bit of different viewpoints, and I think that will come out in the podcast. Thanks, Don.
All right. So tonight's topic is the contract management standard. And first, I'll give you a little background on what it is. So NCMA, National Contract Management Association, it's kind of the leading professional organization for contract managers. They've been around since 1959. I'm a member. Jennifer, I'm sure, is a member. Well, one of the things that they're doing to establish themselves or to establish contract management as a profession is to kind of formalize a body of knowledge. And one of the things they did is they came up with this contract management standard, and they got it accredited by approved by the American National Standards Institute. And it kind of gives a framework to what is the profession of contract management. There's a more detailed document that goes along with the contract management standard called the Contract Management Body of Knowledge. And that's been around longer than the standard. And that kind of defines a little bit better than some of the words and terms that we see in the standard itself. But it's published. There's an opportunity for people in the profession to give their feedback. There's a committee that oversees this, and they keep it updated, things like that. So that's basically what it is. I think personally, I think it's a good thing to have, because someone new to the profession, if they want to know, like, what is contract management, like, what are the things I should know, it generally answers that question. It kind of tells people where contract management begins and ends. I've also used the framework to develop a development plan for employees. So you can kind of take the competencies and then kind of steer your employees to where they need to develop their competencies to become more well-rounded contract management professionals. So it's I like that it exists. Now, having said that, I don't totally like the contents of it, and I'll tell you why. The setup is okay. It basically, you have the standard, and it defines certain guiding principles that will apply throughout all different life cycle phases. It defines different life cycle phases within contracting, and I think that's good. That's kind of how I've been teaching contracting for a long time. You have pre-award, award, and post-award. And then it defines certain domains within those life cycle phases. And then it gets into certain competencies and job tasks. So this is how it's fleshed out in the contract management standard. So you've got your guiding principles, and these are your 7 guiding principles. And those are good. I'd agree with those, that those are types of things that, you know, all contract managers should have. I would probably, there's probably some others that are missing, but, you know, as a starting point, that's okay. It divides up the life cycles, pre-award, award, post-award. And then within each of the different life cycles, you have your domains, and it's good because it kind of encompasses competencies from the buyer side and from the seller side. So you have develop solicitation, develop offer. So there's things like that I like about it. But for me, when it starts to fall apart is when we get into the competencies and the specific tasks that are mentioned. So right down here we have pre-award life cycle, and then we get into the competencies, which are develop solicitation and develop offer. I'm sorry, those are domains. And then this is the competency, plan solicitation and request offer. And then these are the buyer job tasks. Now I've been at this a while. I just passed 26 years since I've been in this field, and there's some things in here that I would not say are the task of the contract manager, or I wouldn't know how to explain them to other people. For example, evaluate requirement achievability. I don't know what that is. I don't know what exactly that task entails. And if I read the contract management body of knowledge, which kind of goes into more detail, what that is, I'm still at a loss for what exactly the contract manager's role is in that. I'm not sure the contract manager does a needs assessment. I kind of think that's something that a client or a customer does, and then they'll bring it to a contract manager. There's some others that jumped out at me. So those were kind of the pre-award ones. And now the seller side, I can't really say anything about because I haven't been on the seller side of contract management. So I'm going to take what they say here as I assume that that's accurate. But Nick, you can tell me, do sellers really do these things? And then when we get into award, then we start coming up with this vocabulary that I don't think anybody uses. For example, I think there was something that they had like an offer evaluation plan. So that might have been up in the number two one. Finalize, yeah, formulate offer evaluation plan. Okay, I don't think anybody uses that terminology. I mean, the government uses source selection plan. Um, the government's doing most of the buying. Why are we inventing new language? Um, so anyway, that's kind of generally my my take on this. Is it's a good thing to have generally. Starts out good, but when you get down into trying to define what the tasks are, it becomes less useful. What do you think, Jennifer?
Well, I agree. I think that one, it's fabulous that they developed this. I mean, I think for a long time, the contract management body of knowledge was kind of the best compendium, or I don't know what else to call it, in the field for at least here's what you should know. And oddly enough, you would think that someone in the federal government would have created that list. And I think to some degree there was some idea of it in terms of the certification, but it still wasn't nearly as fleshed out. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but it kind of just bugs me that they call these things domains. Like to me, they should be like categories or subcategories or something. Like it's like they were just coming up with different words. But as they move down, I think that's where the rubber hits the road, or the point of execution is typically where I think a lot of the training or even standards just tend to fall apart, because as you're there sitting in your you go and you look at this, and or you go to a training course and then you go back to your desk and someone's like, okay, well, here's your procurement package, and then you have to figure out how to what do I actually do, and perform a needs assessment. Well, what is that? Whose needs are we talking about? And especially on the government side, it gets quite complicated, because are we talking about the bare minimum needs of from a taxpayer perspective, or are we talking about the what the person actually wants? So I think there's a lot of confusion still and vagueness at the task level, um, in every category. And that's why I think, certainly at DAU, I think the training kind of ended somewhere around the subcategory level, the actual
Yeah.
tasks, apart from maybe, just very, very rudimentary, just didn't really occur in at least the classes that I remember.
Yeah, there was a contracting competency model that's been replaced that I thought was pretty good.
That
Uh,
one came out in 2010, though, or
yeah,
no,
it was old.
5, 4 or 5. Yeah.
Yeah, it was old. Um, but what I liked about it is it was more applicable to a DoD contract specialist and someone who was going to use the FAR and the DFARs. Um, it's not as easy you know, to kind of make the connection between everything I'm seeing in this standard to FAR, DFARs, etc.
Well, one thing I wanted to say before Nick gives his perspective on the industry side is it's entirely feasible, that on the state and local government side, or even more of the commercial side, like straight commercial, where one industry company A is buying from company B, that they do call it offer evaluation plan.
Could be.
A lot of state and local that I've discovered does in fact mirror the FAR to some degree, but others don't, which is actually why when I bought my first copy of the contract management body of knowledge, I filed it more with state and local, because I felt like it fit more effectively with that chunk of literature that I had than with, straight up federal government. Having said that, I think the bulk of the members of NCMA are federal government contractors, buyers.
Or, yeah, yeah. So, Nick, I want to take a look at the sales side of this. So, according to MCMA, this is what contractors do.
All right. Before we go there, I want to make some initial remarks, if you don't mind. I think part of the issue is, now let me start out by saying I was a member of NCMA for more than 20 years. I've written articles for Contract Manager magazine, and I like it. I like it a lot. I think it does a great job for its members. That being said, I left about 10 years ago. It just wasn't meeting my needs at the time. But I'm aware of this. I use this in some of the classes I teach. And I think, Don, maybe part of your problem to some extent is that you're looking for a specific application. And I think Jennifer was just mentioning this. This has to be all things to all people, right? Because it's the profession. And so not only does it have to speak to federal government contracting officers, but it also has to speak to commercial construction and state and local and the subcontract management team, right? So it has to cover this broad range. So almost by definition, they have to be a little mealy-mouthed in their language so that everybody gets something, rather than specifically focusing on this is the federal government 1102 standard or contract specialist standard versus this is the government contractor subcontract management standard, right? So they just have one standard. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind before we get overly critical on the whole thing, is they're really almost by definition trying to be all things to all people. And I also want to say, it's interesting to me when I deal with contractors who are commercial contractors and they say they want to get into the government, almost universally, the one thing that they all don't have is a contract administration function. They don't even know what that is in the commercial world, by and large. It's marketing, or it's order entry, or it's something else, but it's not called contract administration, and you really can't find it. So oftentimes I have to explain to them, you're going to have to hire somebody who does this, who can, negotiate with the government and ensure that you're meeting the contract terms and conditions and can deal with change orders. And you'd be shocked, I think, at how few of them actually have that ready to go. At one primarily commercial company I supported a while ago, their change orders were being signed by the marketing admin, basically the secretary, although we don't use that term anymore. She was signing all the change orders. They came in, she signed them. It was all good, right? Nobody thought of whether she should sign. So I just want to mention that before we get into the details here, which thank you for causing me to put my glasses on for this. It's not bad. I'm looking at this. It's fine. They call them risk mitigation plans. I don't think many people actually list .3, .1, .2, .3, .4. I don't think a lot of them, very few companies I've dealt with would say that all falls under risk mitigation, right? But they'd probably all be done, just more spread out among the functions. They're not unified like that would tell you. And I had a boss once, and he said that if you're really serious about contracting as a profession, you should be able to do everything. You should be able to buy, to sell, to manage subcontracts. He was a big believer, like, if this is your profession, You need to do it all. You can't tell me that you're just a buyer of commodities when I need you to negotiate a complex subcontract. No, you can't tell me you only buy when I need you to actually interface with the government and represent us, the seller. So I'm kind of happy with this, right? From that respect. But when you look at the details, as you both said, nah, I could probably quibble with it. You know, risk mitigation plans are rarely something that's formal like this. Should they be? Perhaps they should be. But who's got the staffing for that? Who's got the budget for that? Very few that I'm aware of. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. One thing that I thought of while you were talking is there is I don't know if we call it a field, but there is this function of capture, right, on the contractor side.
Yeah.
And I don't see that as a subset of contract management. Do you? Like, would that be something a contract manager does?
That's marketing and sales. But
Right,
oftentimes there's going to be a contract manager involved
right,
to help out, maybe interpret the RFP instructions um, or to help shape the draft RFP to give comments in, right? So there's a role for contracts to play in that, but no, I would not normally think that that is a contract management function.
yeah. Um,
So
I see it.
sorry, just to because I just want to summarize what I think I hear ourselves saying, which is so on the industry side of the house, it's much more common to be fluid and to jump around in it within these tasks and within these roles and functions, whereas on the government side of the house it's less common, more maybe more rigid, more structured, like we do have formalized plans and documentation. And I think you find, I mean, I'm guessing that we find more specialization on the government side of the house. Like you can just be only buying commodities depending on where you work, or that sort of a thing. um, is are we in agreement with
Well,
with
perhaps
those?
I misled you because although my boss was a big believer in that, I'm not sure that that is universally held, right? Um, you know, at the bigger defense contractors, they're probably going to be a little more specialized. They're going to be purchasing agents or buyers, and some will focus on commodities and some will focus on complex subcontracts. And there'll be prime contract administrators, right? So there is specialization, but the body of knowledge basically is the same, right? You if you're dealing with complex procurements, you're probably digging in a lot deeper and thinking about it. Well, you should. And if you're just, doing orders off a BOA or something for commodities at fixed prices that have already been negotiated, probably not that much thought leadership involved. But it is all part of the same, I know you hate this word, Jennifer, domain. It's all part of the contract management profession, at least, and I believe this to be true, right? It's the same skill set, whether you are applying it at a simplified level or a more complex level. It's the same thing. I think it is. We could argue about it if you want, but make it interesting podcast. But I feel strongly it's all the same thing.
Now, well, I wasn't trying to say that they were different things. I think what I was trying to say is I think on the industry side of the house, it's more common to get exposure to, just perform a lot of those tasks throughout. Um,
Yes.
and maybe that varies. I mean, obviously that has to vary by the size of the contractor that you're dealing with.
Let me give you, for instance, I know this contractor, not a top 10 defense contractor, but a decent sized contractor. And there is a vice president of purchasing and contracts, both together. And then under that, there is a director of contracts for the sell side, and there's a director of purchasing for the buy side. And then under the director of purchasing, there are two other directors, one for purchasing commodities and one for purchasing complex subcontracts. But so it is differentiated, but it all rolls up. And that vice president of contracts and procurement is expected to be able to solve problems at any level. So if you are somebody in this profession and one day you'd like to be a vice president of contracts and procurement, seems to me this is the body of knowledge you have to master. Does that make it more clear, Jennifer?
Yes, and I guess my other question is, going like looking at these seller job tasks and the comment that you had made about, develop a risk mitigation plan. I'm going to presume, and you can correct me or if I'm wrong, but the only reason a buyer would do that is if they had some kind of internal, by buyer, I mean the industry, the offer would do that, is if they had some kind of internal requirement to do that, or if there was a contract clause that required that.
Yes, so we definitely develop a pricing strategy in the contractor side of things. There's definitely a pricing strategy. But you know what? Marketing controls that, to Don's earlier point, right? We call it a P2W, price to win, P to win, right? Probability of win. And it goes out and evaluates the competition, what their likely pricing is going to be. You do your own strengths and weaknesses analysis. Where do you stack up against the competition? What do we know about the budget? All these facts are got out, and it comes into a hopefully very robust pricing strategy. Says, here's where we need to be. And by the way, we're weak in this area. We better go out and team with a subcontractor who's strong in this area so that we'll get evaluated across the board where we want to be. Right?
Yeah,
so
and I think you just
is a whole pricing strategy, but it isn't contracts leading it.
Right.
Well, and I think you just made Don's point is, like everything that you just said would be, it'd be nice to have that kind of encapsulated somewhere. Like, these are the things that developing a pricing strategy may include, and it may be performed by, marketing or, some combination of people. Because I'm imagining on the industry side, the second task there, like develop terms to manage risk, is that primarily performed by attorneys?
Hopefully. The one that I see here that just stands out as being wrong is develop technical approach. Nobody in contracts ever develops the technical approach. Those people are typically called engineers.
Right.
Or program managers, if you will, if nothing else. That's, you could argue that it's contract's job to be the glue that holds this all together, that ensures that these things are being done by the appropriate people, but they don't develop it. And I would argue strongly, they don't have the ability to evaluate it. So what are you doing here?
Yeah, I've recently been involved in a proposal effort for a major defense contractor. And the way they approached it is they have the capture manager who's been looking at the opportunity for years in advance. Like by the time the solicitation comes out, that's, they've already done most of the work, right? Then you have a proposal manager who's under the capture manager who kind of, once the proposal is ready to be executed, once, solicitation's out, they're watching for the solicitation. They're even developing some contingent plans for what the solicitation might say. And then once it comes out, the proposal, typically they ask for multiple volumes. And then there's different volume leaders. So like there's the small business volume leader. There's the price volume leader. There was one for resumes in the last one, and there was a resume volume leader.
The management volume leader.
Yeah, this luckily they didn't have it this time. They had past performance, but there was only one volume that was led by a contract manager, and that's like the one who made sure that the reps and certs were filled out, the one who made sure that it was signed, and
Mhm.
all the teaming agreements were in place and things like that.
Yeah.
So there was definitely involvement by a contract manager, but a lot of the tasks were not contract manager tasks. They were somebody else's tasks.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem with having a general knowledge of what goes on during the proposal process, but I wouldn't call these contract manager tasks.
Right. So the question has to be, is it a task for a contract manager to perform, or is it a task of which the contracting manager needs to have whatever knowledge is sufficient about it to see that it's done? Right? Maybe that's where we should,
Yeah, if it's
agree.
that, if it's the latter, then that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe
Let's
that's
talk
one
about
thing
some
they
of
need
the,
to do to improve this is actually specify, be like, okay, knowledge of, vice performance of.
That's kind of
yeah.
when I took this and made an IDP out of it, the development plan. I kind of put proficiency levels in there so that the manager could use it and they could check off like how much proficiency does my employee need for this task. And it could be just knowledge of. It could also be they can perform it with assistance or perform it without assistance. Um, so yeah, so that'll
I'm
vary.
chuckling because I'm thinking of our podcast where we discussed the back to basics and what contract specialists today should know on the federal government level, or at least within DoD. And I'm thinking, I guess legal is the one who would perform most of these tasks in, in the federal
Yeah.
government today. And the contract specialist job would just be to make sure legal sees a copy so that legal can do all of these things.
Buyer job
Yes.
task.
Make sure
See legal.
carry it to legal. Carry it to legal for a sign off. So, but you're right, Jennifer. And I was thinking the same thing. This does relate to that podcast because according to my information, which is Don Acquisition, the DoD competency model is based on this standard. So this is totally relevant to that podcast. This is, if you're new to the federal government contracting profession and you walk in the door, this is your competency model. This is what you're supposed to know.
Right.
Right, Don? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think getting back to your comment about this has to be all things to all people, um, then I guess maybe they should have changed some of the vocabulary when they adapted it in DoD, because we do have a standard vocabulary that's been around for a very long time. And having to memorize a new vocabulary, um, to me, doesn't seem like, it's like if I'm in DoD, am I going to determine owner furnished property equipment information management? No, we call it government property. We call it government furnished property. We've been calling it that for years. Let's use the same terminology. Um, we
I'm going to
don't
agree
do
with you
Well,
300%. I'm going to
yeah.
agree with you on that, Don, and I'll let Jennifer speak in a hair here.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
The ability to come into a profession is often measured by the ability to speak the language.
Mm-hmm.
Every profession has, whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or apparently contract manager, you got to be able to speak the language. And if
Yeah.
they're intentionally changing the language, they are sowing confusion. Sorry to you, Jennifer.
well, I was just going to agree also and say at a minimum, they should make it consistent with what's in the regulation. I mean, the FAR is obviously the gold standard for, on the federal government side of the land, of what's required. And, to some degree, there's some prescriptive language in there, at least of how to do things. And so the language should match the FAR.
Yeah, like plan solicitation. We call it acquisition planning. We've been calling it that for years. If we want this to mean something to a DoD contracting officer, let's say plan acquisition.
Or if we want new
Well,
people to know, have an idea of what they're doing, if they've used this to develop themselves outside of the field and then come into the field as a new person, they're going to be like, I'm ready to plan the solicitation. And the, contracting officer will be like, what are you talking about?
Right. Um,
exactly. That's exactly the point I was making. People, this is going to sow confusion and it's going to create a bifurcation of the acquisition workforce that wasn't there before. Because there will be the old timers who speak the language that has been spoken for generations, not to speak, not to go to hyperbole about it. And then there'll be the new people who are speaking the DoD competency model, which is based on words and phrases that nobody else speaks. This is going to be a problem.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Now, I think that DoD made a big mistake when they adapted this because they misinterpreted what was in the contract management standard, and I'll show you what I mean. So in the contract management standard, we have these helpful graphs and then a narrative explanation of what the graph is trying to say. And one of the things, let's see, we have in this graph here, let's see, where is it? We have these guiding principles, and the way this is supposed to read, if we kind of look at this and then look at the words that are written, all of these guiding principles apply to all phases of acquisition. Okay. Now, and that's actually what is said here. Guiding principles for contract management are applicable throughout all phases of the contract life cycle and all contract management circumstances. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, good. Then there's this graph. Okay. That isn't as clear as the one above it. And this makes it seem like the, what do we call them now? Life cycle phases are subordinate only to 1.4, right? Which is not consistent with what we just read, but that's how DoD interpreted it. So when they came up with their contracting competency model, they looked at that second graph and then put all of the life cycle phases just under regulatory compliance. And when I first saw that, I was like, okay, that's wrong. And then I contacted, I posted it on Collaborate, which is the NCMA discussion forum, and I said, is it me or did DoD mess this up? And then somebody from NCMA said, yes, they messed it up. And he was going to communicate that to DAU. I followed up with him months later, and he said, well, I haven't yet, but we're going to meet with them, or the CEO is going to meet with DAU next week, and we're going to bring it up. So subsequent to that, he informed me that DAU was notified. They acknowledged the mistake. And I think the reaction was like, yeah, I see that's wrong, but the other stuff is right. It's like, okay, great.
Well, as somebody who's primarily a regulatory compliance specialist, that's primarily what I do day to day. I'm glad that everything else in the contracting domain is subordinate to me. I will now call the vice president of contracts and procurement
Yeah,
and tell him, oh, by the way, you now work for me.
yeah,
Um,
Well,
that's
and
good
to
for me.
me, this is contributing to exactly what DoD is trying to get away from, which is a field of contract professionals who are focused purely on regulatory compliance. Don't get me wrong, I love the regulations. I live and breathe them every day, but the regulations are there to help further a larger goal, which is the actual, meeting of the requirement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's definitely a mistake, and it's very telling that DAU acknowledges his mistake, yet hasn't corrected it yet.
It's not their document to correct. It's the Defense Pricing and Contracting's document. So they're the ones that would have to issue a correction.
Okay, we need to have a whole separate podcast where you guys educate me on the role of DAU and the director of DCMA and the director of DPC and who does what and who's responsible for what, because it makes no sense to me that DPC is responsible for training DCMA contracting officers. That makes no sense to me. But separate podcasts, please, where you'll explain the logic of the whole organizational structure to me.
Okay. We'll tee that up. So anyway, just to close the loop on this, the certification exam for the new one-level certification that DoD is going to be using is based on knowledge of this standard.
Mm-hmm.
So new people are going to have to memorize
the
this new
21st
terminology.
century AWF is based on this. Sorry, Don, I spoke over.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's just memorizing this stuff. Like a sample question will be like, under what competency is determined supply chain support, right? And knowledge, that type of knowledge will get you a certification.
Assuming you need a certification.
I don't think
because if you're already, no, it's not good.
What's that?
I just finished getting certified on Sarbanes-Oxley COSO internal controls, and it was a 3-hour exam, just like what you described. What is the principle? What is the guiding focus? That's not knowledge application. That's just memorization. Right. Will it be an open book test, Don? It will be an open book, will it?
Probably not. Probably not, because then you're not testing knowledge of the standard, you're testing the ability to find that information. So it's a different competency.
We'll make it open book, open notes, because you're not really testing anything. But perhaps I'm cynical on that.
No. Yeah, I think there is a body of knowledge in the FAR, like a structure of a body of knowledge in the FAR. And that's one of the reasons in the FAR boot camp and then later in Con 90, we had people memorize FAR parts. So you have that structure in your mind, always. It's like memorizing a map of the town. So whatever input, you can put it somewhere in that map. So now we kind of have two maps.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Well, and I have this thought that it might be time to not necessarily chuck the FAR out, but revise or update the FAR, because over time they've certainly like they'll put certain, like for instance, they'll put stuff in FAR Part 9 that has almost the exact same equivalent type of stuff in FAR Part 25. Like in FAR Part 9 now you can't do business in the Sudan, but in FAR Part 25 you can't do business in Iraq. And so they're almost the exact same policies, but they're in like, it's like depending on who has the FAR case, they put them in these different areas.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. It used to drive me crazy. I remember there was a rule that basically prohibited you to write something in specifications that called for a certain type of material, right? Where would you put that in the FAR? What part? It says you can't specify use of a certain material.
Well, I assume FAR Part 11, defining requirements.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. That's what I think too. They put it in 25, right? And it's like, well, why? And the reason was because the manufacturer of this, whatever this thing was, this material, was foreign, and they didn't want us to specify use of this foreign material. But the message to the contracting officer is don't use this, don't specify this stuff in your specifications. That needs to be in part 11, describing agency needs, right?
Well, and I
But
think that's kind of what we're saying is, I think the time has come to like re-examine where stuff landed in the FAR and maybe
yeah,
marry it up to some sort of competency model. That
yeah,
would be the ideal world.
yeah,
If you could also rationalize the clauses that apply to commercial item contracts, that would be very helpful, especially for,
I mean, why some do
I
and
went on
some
a,
don't?
I went on a snark hunt or a snipe hunt for all those clauses one time. And I had to call Don. I'm like, Don, what's going on? He goes, well, did you look over here? Did you look over there? Why isn't it where it should be? Because it's not. So thank you for that, Don, expert. But yeah, could you do that while you're at it? Because that to me is a great example of, trying to follow what are the mandatory commercial item flow down clauses
Yeah.
for FAR and DFARs. And could they all just be in one place, please?
Yeah, and I think that's where, I think we could make that a whole separate podcast too, because especially when I was doing my contract clauses course, I just, it was driving me crazy. I'm like, why, what? It just was very confusing. But I do think it ties back to this competency model because you do, like as Don just said, there's like two separate maps now because you have this map, you have this way the FAR is laid out and the way the DFARs is laid out, and that's been the standard for training to some degree, although we've overlaid, this pre-award, award and post-award on top of it, but the FAR can handily kind of fit into those categories, generally speaking. But then you end up with this now competency model that it doesn't mesh as well.
And that is
Just
the
to,
problem because the new competency model is the basis for the back to basic 21st century AWF that we talked about in the previous podcast.
yeah,
It is bifurcating the knowledge domain. I'm sorry, Jennifer, I keep using that. We bifurcated it into those who speak FAR and DFARs and other agency supplements, and those who now will not.
that was
That will be
actually
the
done.
DoD.
That was done because Congress required DoD to adapt well, an industry standard for certification, something like that. But it was kind of in response to congressional action. But I still think they could have tailored it a little better.
It
So why
reminds
do
me
you
of
guys?
what they did with government property when they had to do government property systems should be based on consensus industry standards.
Yeah.
But okay, Congress doesn't do that in a vacuum, right?
Uh-huh.
There had to be somebody pushing for it. And I'm not aware of any government contractor or industry association that pushed for that.
Probably NCMA.
Well, but they don't really play at that level, you think? I don't think they play. They're not like NDIA or AIA or CODSIA.
I don't know.
Okay, but the point is that has to come from somewhere. They don't Congressman A or Senator B doesn't wake up one morning and go, I think we should have consensus standards for all contracting officers. Doesn't happen.
Yeah. Just going back to what you were saying of like, how confusing the clauses can be, especially when it comes to commercial items. This is the one that, when you're teaching a new person, contract clauses, where it's just you have to admit it makes no sense. Like this is a clause that says use this clause in all solicitations and contracts, right? And I'll ask them, does it go in in a solicitation for commercial items, right? And they'll say yes. But the answer is no. And that's absurd that the answer is no when you see it written like this in all solicitations and contracts. And the reason is because there's this convention in the DFARS that if it does apply to a commercial item contract, then it says it has this extra language. It'll either say including solicitations and contracts for commercial items, or sometimes it'll say except.
But it's inconsistent, because and that was what I noticed when I was creating this course is like this prescription language is extremely inconsistent. Sometimes it will say including, sometimes it will say except, other times it will say in all, and it doesn't say anything. It doesn't include, including commercial items or
Right,
except commercial items. So you have to do some further digging to figure out, does this mean commercial items?
right.
No,
Um,
exactly. And when you realize that all doesn't mean all, you're well on your way to understanding the absurdity of contract management, the body of
right,
knowledge that you've set out to master.
right. I mean, when you get a new person, they're just like, why is that? And you just say, you can explain it, but it's not a justification at all. There's no good reason that things are like that. I remember like I'd have students that their legal would say, put that in your commercial solicitation. It says all. And I'd have to dig up the old Federal Register notice, which says, if something's going to go in a commercial contract, it's going to have these magic words. It'll be listed in 212.3. Otherwise, it's not required. And why should you have to do all that stuff just to, explain something? It should be
Well,
clear.
let me unpack what you just said a little bit. If you go back to that podcast that we keep referencing, we talked about contracting officers don't need to know as much anymore, or at least we thought maybe we asserted that because they were just going to go to legal. All their procedures said if there's any kind of interpretation, you go to legal, and legal will tell you what to think. You just gave a great example of the fallacy of that instruction to do that. Legal isn't often as well trained as a seasoned contracting officer.
You know, I think another good topic for a podcast, evaluating legal advice, right? For contracting officers, evaluation of legal advice.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's a skill you have to have. And a lot of contracting officers just defer. And I don't know
Come up
about you,
with a way
Jennifer, but to me, it's been hit and miss with government contract attorneys.
Well, absolutely. But that is the expectation. I mean, there's certainly this thought process within the government side of the house that if legal says this, then it is absolutely right, which would absolutely drive me nuts because, when you think about the very definition of an attorney, in any court case, these are both attorneys who disagree with each other. So,
One of
this
them's
thought
always wrong.
process that yeah, well, this thought process that just because an attorney says something, it is absolutely correct and you must do it is it's upsetting, especially when they are wrong. I mean, I had a number of times, and I won't name names, but I would have to dig out my Nash and Sabinic book, and and you have to finesse it because of the political environment, but you would have to go into legal and say, um, I understand what you said, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but can you just explain to me, when I'm reading this book, how these court cases and this is the general rule, and and if you finesse it right, then they'll, well, let me relook at this, and then they'll, come back either with a better. And sometimes I was wrong. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that I was always the correct one, but they would come back with a better explanation of something that I didn't understand, or they would reevaluate their own advice based on, the gold standard, of government attorneys, which would be, Ralph Nash and his collections. And so I think that, but yeah, it was very upsetting to me because it was just definitely like, oh, legal said it, it's right.
Right.
I
You
have
know,
al-
go ahead.
I have almost no experience with DCMA legal, except having to brief them when they were investigating companies I worked for. But let's move that on. My only real experience with DCMA legal was I used to teach um, federal publication seminars courses. I don't know how many people know what that is, but they're an external seminar provider. They're a good one. So I used to come in, and one time I got a phone call. Hey, Ralph Nash is sick. Can you teach his course in cost reimbursement contracting? And I'm like, no. Anyway, they offered me money, and I said yes. So turns out Ralph doesn't use slides or have any notes because it's all anyway. One of my students was a DCMA attorney, right? He was there, and I was terrified. He was going to rip me up. He was going to know what an imposter I was, right? So anyway, it was great. He never asked a single question. He showed up on time. He left on time. There were no questions. I finally, on the last day, I'm like, what's going on here? What are you doing? He goes, oh, yeah, I came from the poker. So he would show up at class, he would take the class that he already knew, and then he would go off every night and play poker until 3 a.m. That was apparently his MO. That's my impression of DCMA legal.
So the training was in Las Vegas?
Yep. Yep.
I was thinking DC. I'm like, oh, is there a big poker thing in DC?
No, they're twice a year do the training in Las Vegas.
Hmm.
But anyway, that's the Las Vegas story I can tell. But that's what I think I know about DCMA legal. They show up on time, they don't ask any questions, they leave on time, and then they play poker all night. Did I get that wrong?
Also, no. Another thing I was going to add when you were talking is evaluating auditor advice. Maybe the podcast should be like evaluating professional advice, and you could cover like legal advice, audit advice, because that's another area where contracting officers just kind of take what the auditor said and throw it at the contractor.
Oh my
You know,
God.
they don't.
Started on that. I'm going to write a blog article really soon now when I'm finished with the one series I'm writing now. It's going to be about the court case where the DCMA legal refused to prosecute the case after they realized what a bad case they had. And the contractor, and they withdrew the final decision so that it was all moot, right? Contractor begged for the judge to rule on it because they'd been back at the ASPCA 4 or 5 times for the same issue. Year after year, the auditors would question it. The contracting officer would agree with the auditors, issue a COFD, and then they'd have to hire lawyers and go to the board. And then just before it was about to be litigated, the government would realize, we can't litigate this. There's no basis for this. And then they would withdraw it, mooting the whole issue. And it's costing the contractor millions, right? So yeah, please, we gotta, that can be a different podcast, but
Yeah.
I got an opinion
Well,
on
but
that.
I think it ties back to this standard, because if you have this professional standard, then and if it's fleshed out, I think that's where, at the competency level, then in theory everything should be able to be run through that, and people should more or less end up in agreement. I mean, as much as you can end up in agreement in a legal, quasi-legal field anyways.
Well, that's very thought provoking that you said that, because if you're an accountant or a lawyer or one of these other professions where you can get certified because there's a standard that you're held to and you can get tested in it, there's also a governing body that you can actually file a complaint with and say this person violated the standard, right? And if you are persuasive, they will be disciplined. Attorneys can be disbarred.
Right.
Right? So what is the commensurate mechanism here with this new contract management standard? Who do I call or who do I write to say this contracting officer professed to be a trained person with this standard and yet violated it anyway?
That's a great point. I think there should probably be. I think you should have to uphold certain standards to sign a contract. Like you should be able to have demonstrated that you meet and are held to certain standards to sign a contract, a public contract. And there should be a way to complain if somebody is not holding up to those standards. I think there is something in NCMA where you kind of agree to abide by those standards, but I don't think there's any consequence if you don't. You might get kicked out of NCMA, or you could lose your certification. But you don't need a certification to really do anything, to sign a public contract. It's not like, signing off on a financial report or something like that, or giving legal advice.
Once you pass the test, you're in. You're in like Flynn forever, right? Isn't that the new B2B?
Well, but I think that's probably the standard that DoD certainly has been striving for. When we professionalize the acquisition workforce, this goes back to that discussion of all of these professional career fields that DoD was I guess copying to some degree, which is attorneys, doctors, lawyers. They do have a board, and all of them can lose their license for malpractice. I mean, I just don't know any government contracting officer that has lost their license, so to speak. I mean, they've lost warrants, but even then, they surface 5 years later with a signing bonus
Yeah.
you know.
There's no third-party certification, really. It's kind of the organization is certifying their own people. So if they revoke a certification, it hurts them. So why would they do that?
Yeah, why would they?
Yeah.
Well, but I think this is what's driving Congress. Congress keeps reading these horrific news accounts, some of which are not entirely accurate, of course, but they read these news accounts of, the mistakes the their own acquisition workforce keep making. And so they keep striving to, pass legislation that will somehow fix the problem. But I think that for me, that's a lot of what it boils down to is, it's not an independent standard. It's a standard that's kind of being administered by itself. It's like me saying, well, I need a standard, and yes, I meet the standard, because I've just created my own standard for myself, so of course I'm going to meet the standard. And it's obviously a little more complex than that, but that's essentially what happens. I have in my career, I've witnessed people make colossal mistakes and not learn from those mistakes. I mean, it's one thing if you learn from the mistake and become a better contracting officer, but I've witnessed people make mistakes and not even realize that they were making those mistakes, and then come back, and they kind of leave a job in disgrace, and then again, that like 5-10 years later, they resurface as the new 2 levels higher, with making a lot of money, and it's scary, what's happening out there.
Yeah. All right. We've probably been at this about an hour. Any closing remarks?
Well, I'll make
go.
mine, which is, well, I'll go and then Nick can go. But yeah, I mean, I think it's great that there is a standard. I mean, I commend NCMA absolutely for creating one, and DoD came along and said, yeah, we should have one too, and more or less copied it. And it is, but I think that this is where NCMA has, I guess, the benefit over DoD is it's a little bit more flexible. It's a living document, and they're welcoming comments to change and improve. And they do, I believe, they do change and improve as they get those comments. So we have a standard now, and we have this contract management body of knowledge. But I think now it remains to be fleshed out as far as like levels of competency. What happens if you are caught violating these standards? I think there's some other areas that need to be fleshed out still.
About you, Nick?
I'll echo what Jennifer said to a large extent. I think NCMA has done a good job in creating this standard. And I think it was a hard job because I think they really had to be all things to all people. There's so many different versions of what contract management means out there in the world when you get beyond the government. So I think they did a good job. I am less complimentary about DoD's adoption of it. I feel, rightly or wrongly, that they took the lazy way out, which is just to lock, stock, and barrel, take the whole thing, lift it, and make it their own, rather than creating an appropriate parallel standard that would better work for government contracting officers. Because they didn't put in the work and let NCMA do the work, I think they ended up with a substandard product.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I don't know if I would agree with that at the beginning of the podcast. So talking through this kind of changed my mind a little bit. Yeah, I guess I'm more critical of DoD's adaptation of the standard than the standard itself, because I'm kind of looking at it as trying to train a DoD person who now has to memorize this new vocabulary that they're not going to need for any other reason than to pass the certification test, because nobody's going to be using this vocabulary when they get to their job. They're going to be using the type of vocabulary that's in the FAR, the DFARs, or their supplements, or even their specific contracting activity might have certain vocabulary. But I generally, I think we're headed in the right direction. Defining what is contract management, what are the things you need to know. It just needs work. So, all right, that's where I'll leave it. Thank you to the Acquivores. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. A couple podcast ideas we've tossed around tonight. Maybe we'll put some flesh on those and come up with something better. All right.